Shall we start? Cool. Welcome to the Lean Startup Track. Thanks for coming. My name's Sam McAfee, and before I tell you a little bit about myself and get into the topic, can I get a show of hands of how many people are already very familiar with Lean Startup and the principles behind it? Okay, cool. Is anyone brand new to Lean Startup? Great, okay. So just trying to get a sense of how far to skew. Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about quantifying risk for teams applying Lean Startup methods, teams who are trying to do innovation. But before I get into my topic, I want to kind of introduce myself and then say a little bit about Lean Startup in general. So I started doing software engineering probably about 15 years ago, and I have done consulting, I've worked in product companies, and I've seen lots of different teams doing things lots of different ways. I've been involved in Agile for quite a while, and both the Kanban and Lean Startup communities for quite a while as well. I have had some exposure to larger companies, but most of my experience has been with startups. I've been part of 3. One was my own creation, the other 2 I was a key player. All were wild rides and flamed out spectacularly at the end. So I have a lot of visceral experience with failure in a startup context. I am currently working for a company called Neo. Neo is a global consultancy that does software-powered product development for a connected world. So we do anything from web and mobile apps to APIs and platforms to software for connected devices. One of our founders was Eric Ries, the author of the Lean Startup, and so we do eat, sleep, and breathe Lean Startup principles. We believe in having cross-functional, balanced teams, working very closely together with our clients to build things in a data-driven and evidence-driven approach. Lots of little iterations. So I want to try and explain a little bit about what we've learned in terms of quantifying risk by way of telling you a story. So let me set the scenario here. It's San Francisco Bay Area, 2011, and the company in our story, the protagonists, are a company that is involved in the real estate industry. They're providing services that are pretty tightly correlated with the success of the real estate market. And if you can recall, not too far along from then, 2011 was the bottom of a 3-year slide in real estate. So the people in the story, as we start, were kind of hurting. They were kind of in a bad way. Their revenue was tied to the health of this industry, so they were very squeezed. They were a company that had, because they were in the Bay Area, they had already a pretty well-developed IT infrastructure. They had some good engineers, some good designers on their staff. They're in the Bay Area. They were able to recruit, some of the best from the consumer web space and from the enterprise space. So definitely weren't, technical slouches by any stretch. But still, revenue was getting tighter and tighter, and so they were trying to find ways to break into some new markets, to develop some new product or service that would allow them to have an additional revenue stream. So after some soul searching and some ideation and lots of board meetings and things like that, they arrived at the idea of developing a mobile application to take advantage of some of the data that they had acquired over the time that they've been in business. They had a lot of rich knowledge and data and some functionality that they could package up into a mobile experience that their customers would be able to use to do their jobs better out in the field. So imagine the customer is a service provider around real estate. You could think assessors or architects or contractors or something like that. It's not strictly important which kind, but that's basically their customer base. So they decide to build this mobile app to see if they can break into sort of an adjacent market or extend their runway. And they decide to pull together a tiger team to do this. And the team that they put together, they pull a small handful of the best people from their IT crowd. They're a cross-functional team. They've got a brilliant product strategist who'd been around the block a few times. They have designers and engineers who have worked together on projects. It's a pretty solid team, and they're really excited about taking on this new opportunity. They create a space for themselves to do work that's co-located. They're all in kind of the same area in the building with whiteboards, and it's a very sort of, agile environment. They have experience doing agile development, and the product manager is in the middle of reading the Lean Startup, and he's very excited about trying out some of these principles and practices. So they start out, as one does in Lean Startup, by getting out of the building. So the first thing they do is they go out and they do customer interviews. Because in Lean Startup, a really key point is a successful product has to meet a real customer problem with an effective solution in a sizable and reachable market in order for it to be successful. So usually what we start it with in Lean Startup is by validating that such customer exists and that they really do have this problem. So the first thing these guys do is they start going out and finding customers that fit their prototype. Some are existing customers of the company, some are people that they go and reach out to in the area, and they start interviewing these customers to see if they have the kinds of problems in the field that this application might solve. And they start to get a really good signal. They certainly get feedback early on before they write any code that allows them to make changes in the plan, to make changes in the idea of what they were going to build. So they start that feedback cycle early, very cheaply on paper with conversation and with sketches and prototypes. And eventually they get enough confidence in the product that they're going to build that they think it's worth putting together an app that's maybe 20% of the eventual functionality, but it's the most important 20% from what they've heard so far. And they release it, and people start using it. They have to do a lot of work to kind of get awareness about this app out there. They get permission from finance to buy some Google ads and Facebook ads and various other kinds of digital channels to start getting the word out. They do a little bit of sort of guerrilla marketing and stuff like that. And gradually people in their customer base start to find out about this app and start to download it and use it. It's a purchase, it's a one-time purchase. They buy the app, they use it, and they can kind of test the whether people are sticking with it or not. And after they've done a release, they collect a lot of data. They even go reach out and talk to a couple of customers directly and learn from them and feed that back into the next release. There's tons of bugs. They have to fix them. They do that pretty effectively. Again, like their delivery is not a problem. They're a pretty effective team. So they're pushing frequent iterations out the door. And all the while, they're collecting data about this market and this customer and trying to explore whether this is actually a viable business. So some of the things they're doing is price testing. So believe it or not, there are certainly niche markets where you actually can have this kind of price point for an app for very specialized service professionals. And people are paying it. They do some testing of offering a couple of different price points on a landing page, and they get an idea of what the price can be. And it turns out they solve a problem that's painful enough that people are willing to pay this price point. They also do some research in terms of the size of the market locally, and they determine that there's about 5,000 of these professionals locally. And they estimate that they could eventually roll it out to another 100 cities where there's a similar number of these professionals. So they're starting to get pretty excited. And what they've found so far is the problem is painful enough that from the landing page to purchasing and downloading this app, they're getting an insane 50% conversion rate. Now that's only on a few hundred initial customers, but the numbers look really good, and they're really excited. So they start to get really excited about the numbers, as I said, and they're talking about it a lot around the company, and so it comes time to kind of start to report back some of their findings. Now, by this point, we're probably, I don't know, a quarter and a half along in terms of the process. So there was a lot of rapid iteration of lightweight prototypes and sketches and customer interviews. I mean, that took several weeks. It took them several more weeks to actually build the app and get the first version out there. And they've pushed releases every week or two. So we're really like 3-4 months in. And so the product manager excitedly sends an email to some of the stakeholders. It's a small enough company that he reports directly to the CEO and includes them on an email with a couple of other senior execs about, hey, look, we're doing great. We've got some graphs to show you these exciting numbers, and I think we're headed in the right direction. And within a few hours, he gets an email back from the CEO inviting the whole team to come and meet the very next morning, bright and early, to discuss the results. And so the team is very excited. They get to the meeting. There's a team of 5 of them, and there's several other stakeholders in the room. And the CEO thanks them for their work and announces that they are going to pull the plug on the project. And the team is pretty stunned. They're not really sure what's going on, and they had all these great numbers, so what's happening? And so the CEO, is assuring them that no one's going to get let go, and there are other projects to do, but on this one, the economics just don't make sense. And so he hands it over to the CFO to explain kind of the numbers that they're looking at. And the CFO starts going through, pulls up a spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers, some of which look familiar. They're sort of like a top layer, mostly in green, that they recognize from the data that they've collected. And there are a bunch of other numbers on the bottom that don't look very good at all. And there's a big red line along the bottom. And so the CFO begins to explain that in their excitement to get this product out the door, there are a lot of sort of basic P&L things that they didn't really consider. I list some of them here. They had no idea how much they were spending on Google AdWords and other sort of channel acquisitions. And it turns out that the cost of acquisition was pretty astronomical for such a small user base. They grossly miscalculated what the adoption rate would probably be in the other cities that they were going to roll it out to. It turns out San Francisco is a pretty, tech-savvy area, and to assume a 50% conversion rate in all the other 100 cities that they wanted to roll out to is somewhat folly. And they had a lot of data about this user base nationally that conflicted with that estimate. And there are other things like user retention rates were not as good as they could be, and also people were using this app and then not purchasing the other services that the company was used to selling to these same customer bases. So there was a bit of a cannibalistic effect from the app. So the product manager, is pretty devastated, and he and the CFO go for a walk afterwards, and the product manager asks, hey, Bob, because all CFOs are named Bob, what could we have possibly done to avoid this situation? Or you guys had all this data, and we just, we're a product team. We just didn't know to really look at that particular stuff. And believe it or not, it's fairly common. I've talked to a lot of teams that are building stuff, and they have no idea what the cost of their own team actually is for the company. And Bob explains that in order to understand the risks, there are techniques out there in the world that they can use next time for the next project. And there's actually another project they want them to try, and he suggests that the two of them pair on what are some of those techniques out there. There's actually a whole domain where understanding risks in new markets and understanding them from a financial perspective is very mature and very sophisticated. And that domain is called finance. And so it's possible that we could use some of the techniques that they've picked up over the years in finance to apply to product development to make better decisions. It's kind of a radical idea. So I want to talk about what some of those tools might be. And the message I want to get across here is that there are both qualitative techniques in Lean Startup and there are quantitative techniques in Lean Startup, or in Lean and Agile in general. And it's really important to use them both together and to recognize when one is appropriate and when another is appropriate. And often I find in my own practice that the stuff on the left side here and the qualitative side can provide meaningful inputs and structure to help you determine what you should actually be measuring with the quantitative stuff on the right side. So I want to walk through some of this with you and explain sort of how I've used it with teams. So imagine that, Bob and the PM are seeing in the future that 3 years from now there's going to be this conference and we've got a room full of people who are going to take apart our problem and help us figure out how to solve it. We're going to do that for them right now. So the first thing that we use is something called a business model canvas. Show of hands, seen a business model canvas before? Okay. Show of hands, used one on a regular basis throughout a project? Cool, awesome. So there are some people who have seen this. So there are a bunch of canvases out there. This canvas here is my favorite. It's Alexander Osterwalder's sort of original incarnation. The book, Business Model Generation, is downstairs on the table. If you haven't read it, at a minimum, go browse the table and take a look at that book for a while, but I strongly suggest you buy a copy. It's both beautifully designed and really good content. The idea behind this structure is that you have a model, basically, on paper, on the wall, or on a whiteboard that breaks up a typical business model into these 9 sort of key areas. And the reason why that's really powerful is that in order to have an effective business model, you need all of your components of each of those boxes to be validated, to be working. So the way you use it is you get your team together and you generate a bunch of hypotheses, or a bunch of assertions, really, about each of those things. So who is our customer? Is it 18 to 24 somethings in a music context? Is it, old finance professionals? Who knows? But you have to have some idea of who your customer is before you figure out, whether your product solves a real customer problem in a sizable, reachable market. You also need to know what your value proposition is for that customer. You need to know which channels you're going to use to reach those customers. And different channels work differently for different customers and different problems. So you use this framework to start getting everybody's assumptions out on the table. And the way we do it at Neo is we do one of these at the beginning of every project. And we assume at the beginning that all this stuff is wrong. And the first thing you need to do is to start figuring out which kinds of experiments you can run quickly and cheaply to begin to get information to validate that these things are actually true. And so we build it into our weekly meetings and planning meetings to update the model with the results of the week's experiments. So basically, this kind of forms the inputs of your experiment backlog, if you will. So the business model canvas is a really key sort of foundation for understanding all the things you need to go and test and validate in order to have a successful product. Specifically breaking off of the customer part, we create these things called personas. And the way we do them, there's lots of versions of personas. Some of them are very rich and robust. The ones we use look like this. They're very lightweight. We can throw them away. There's not a lot of attachment to them, but it's a 4-box way of just quickly capturing the key things that we think are true about a customer And one of the boxes you might notice is probably hard to read this, but basically it's behaviors. And there's always a sketch because like we like to have empathy with our customer, so we do a little sketch to make sure that taking some time to just kind of visualize the person. And then we have behaviors, problems, and sometimes it's goals and sometimes it's solutions. It kind of depends on which version we're using. But these personas are basically documents against which we run experiments. So taking that customer box from the business model canvas, we generate a couple of personas for each of the customer segments that we think might be customers we want to test. And we would start going and finding these people. And we would run what we call problem interviews. And that's basically having them say, here's a ranked list of problems that we think you have, and can you give us feedback about whether you have these problems and what severity they might be for you? And there's some lines at the bottom in case you think of any other problems that we didn't think of. And we run many of these, certainly at least about 20. With most of these kinds of interviews, you need 6 or more to start seeing a trend. We try to be safe and run 20 or even 30. And it's a time-consuming process. So when projects are starting and the team hasn't built any code for a couple of weeks because they're running these interviews, it's because there's a fair amount of logistics work in doing this. But it gives you a lot of rich data. And the next thing you would do after you validated the problem interviews, the problems are really real for a customer, is that you can move into the phase of doing various solution tests. So that's when you start to put things in front of them that address the problems that you've now validated that they have. And that can be anything from a verbal description of a solution to a paper prototype or a functional prototype or an actual working early version of a product. There's various gradations, and it depends on how much uncertainty there is about the solution. And that helps you determine how high fidelity your test needs to be and how much investment you do in the test. And that gradually builds up over time. And then there's another tool that we use, which is this modeling tool called Value Dynamics, which is something that was developed by a colleague of mine who's here, Tim James, when we were at change.org, and we've since used it on a bunch of other subjects, and it works quite well to understand what people mean when they express that they value something. And so I'll tell you a brief version of this now and how it's useful in terms of quantitative modeling. But if you're really interested in this particular topic, we're doing a workshop on it tomorrow. You can come by and get the full version. But essentially what this is a diagram of all of the stakeholders in a business ecosystem. So you have various stakeholders that engage in a system. This one in particular is the original snapshot that I took from change.org, but you can imagine any complex product offering, Airbnb, eBay, whatever your favorite multi-stakeholder model is. And you start to figure out for each stakeholder what motivates them to actually engage in the product. What do they value? And for us, we believe that value is something that is not delivered to someone, but rather value is something subjective that's experienced by the user when they consume a product or service. And it's really hard to get a sense of how to define and quantify value unless you really take some time to understand those exchanges between different stakeholders. So people put different things into the system and then get different things out of it. And it's the dynamics of those relationships of value that really drive whether a platform or a product is going to be successful or not. So yeah, it's not interaction specific. It's pretty generalized that someone, so what we have here is that this is a petition creator in the case of change.org and a petition signer. So they have different reasons for engaging in the platform. Petition creator is providing some value to the signer, giving them something to sort of care about and sign. And the signer is providing validation that this petition is worthwhile. So there's an exchange between them. Right, so the labels are basically sort of units of measure that we might want to take a look at to see if we can actually capture this. So some of it is very clearly measurable, and some of it is much harder to measure, and we'll go into a lot more detail on that. Yes? I am not sure. I don't know. So what I find in terms of quantitative modeling is that if it is the case that there is a relationship between two stakeholders that is important for the business, and certainly from a revenue and growth perspective, or maybe if that's informed by a secondary interaction that feeds back and multiplies that first interaction, that's something that I would want to know and start measuring. So you could think of like a viral loop as being a great example. Like every time I share it with a friend, I bring that friend in to sign the petition. That then increases the value back to the creator. Right. So there's all these, multiplicative effects through the graph, right? So we find this a useful way to kind of draw out what some of the relationships might be that are important to look at.
Sit in one place in the canvas, so it's an assumption that you can test it, or is it across the multiple points?
Ideally, it would be something that you would do as a process, and it's actually the conversation that happens while you're doing it, which is actually kind of true of the canvas as well. We find that the process of discussing it is really an important conversation that happens. Keying off of Snowden a little bit, right? So the narratives matter. So you would be able to do this once, maybe keep it for reference, but you could do them multiple times throughout the life of a project to sort of see if your assumptions are still that way.
This is often when you use Canvas, it's a plug-in for a more detailed experiment or analysis, depending on what domain you're in. And so when I use these extensions, I like to say, well, that kind of is these two columns. You want to
Sure.
the high levels
Sure.
here, and so I was just trying to figure out if that could map anywhere on the canvas.
Yeah, I might be able to illustrate some of that actually. Let's see if I can. So I'm going to jump over to the quantitative side for a second. I want to talk about metrics frameworks. So in lean startup or experiment-driven innovation projects, certainly at NEO, we use a mashup of two very popular frameworks that describe sort of how you might measure a product, both the overall life cycle of the product and also the path of customers through the product. So many of you have probably heard of Pirate metrics, Dave McClure's famous acronym for metrics, which is acquisition and activation, retention and revenue and referral, roughly in that order, I think. So that's basically like every individual customer will go through those stages as they go through a product. And then the other framework that we mix it with is something called the Lean Analytics Framework, which is basically over the lifetime of a product as it's being developed, it goes through a phase of what they call empathy, and then what they call stickiness, and then what they call growth. And so the empathy phase is when you're still in the process of validating, do you have a problem worth solving, and are you solving it? Like, are you actually connecting that customer with the problem using your solution? And so while you're in the empathy phase, which can last as long as it lasts until you have measured retained customers, you're measuring different things. There are different things from the Pirate metrics that are important to you. You're more interested in the acquisition and activation stages, right? As you get into stickiness, which are people coming back and using the product on a regular basis, then you still care about acquisition, you still care about activation, but you start to look at retention and possibly revenue. And then when you're in the growth stage of a product, that's when you're really looking at referral and virality. So it's important to know which stage your product is in so you can intelligently use those Pirate metrics. It's meaningless if you're testing something that hasn't even charged yet and you're just trying to prove empathy to start worrying about revenue, right? So like they're relevant in different stages. So we mix those together to give us an idea of what kinds of things that we should be testing. And you can sort of like conceptually connect that back to both the canvas and value dynamics to start thinking about, okay, what are the components of this product system that we're trying to measure and for what purpose? What's our next goal? Are we trying to break out of empathy and prove that now we're in stickiness or whatever? So the metrics frameworks are really important. I'm a really big believer in using cost of delay as a tool to prioritize. And we've heard a lot about cost of delay at this conference. I think that what is tricky for me is that when you're doing cost of delay, there's a couple of assumptions, at least, if you're going straight out of the Reinertsen book, there are some assumptions that are true in some cases and are much harder to find and measure in an innovation context. So the classic model, like at the Lean Startup Conference, I did the 3-hour workshop with Reinertson going through a cost of delay scenario, and it was totally mind-blowing. And the thing that was interesting about it is that you sort of have this assumption of an overall sales life cycle product. So cost of delay is when you're late delivering, what is the sort of erosion of total life cycle profits due to that delay, right? But if you don't know what your total life cycle profits are going to be, if you don't know the shape of that curve, it's really hard to get at cost of delay. And I think in a new product or service, it's a big unknown. You don't know how many of these you're going to sell. You don't know what the time period's going to be like. But you can still use cost of delay in terms of purchasing information. So Lean Startup, all the methods behind it it's applying scientific method to innovation, right? So it's like you're trying these little experiments, and each experiment is throwing something against the universe to kind of measure the ripples and get some data back. So you're reducing a little bit of uncertainty, and it requires an investment. So that's the process of purchasing information, right? So you put a test out, and you get some data back, and now you've reduced your uncertainty. So the key is you want to work on the experiments that have the biggest cost of delay in terms of what are the more important things for you to know first in the product. But that would require you to know of, maybe we're trying to decide between twiddling some features in an experiment on the acquisition funnel versus we're trying to figure out if we can make this thing more viral, or we're trying to add features that might give us better retention. How do we know which one is more important? Well, you can't really know that unless you have a model of the whole system and a way of understanding what the various sensitivities of those different variables are. And it turns out there's a really useful technique for figuring that out, and that's a Monte Carlo simulation. So I've seen Monte Carlo simulations a lot in contexts that are in big finance and insurance, and sometimes in physical and chemical engineering contexts where there's a lot of data and there's a lot of knowns about just the general structure of the problem. I've seen them used a little bit in investment portfolio contexts. And I've certainly, like Troy is talking probably right now about how you can use them to measure the sort of predictability of a delivery team in terms of a Kanban or Scrum context. And all those are great contexts. What we're trying to do at NEO is actually use this to model the extreme uncertainty of a new product or service. So applying it to the combination of the sort of product and business fundamentals. So if you have that pipeline that you're looking at, you've got your acquisition, your activation, your retention, you've got some understanding of the conversion rates, and you've got your product out there where you're able to measure samples of each of those variables on a regular basis, and you're getting different variables, different results on each sampling. As soon as you have a collection where you're measuring the same thing over a series and you're getting different numbers each time, well, you've got a distribution, and that's a prime candidate for one of the components of a Monte Carlo simulation. So what we would use it for is to try to make some predictions about the likely profitability or survival, if not profitability, of some particular product or component given some period of time and given a typical sort of product funnel, right? And then we would start to run experiments against that funnel in the wild and feed that data back into the Monte Carlo simulation, update those distributions with the new data, and then run the simulation again to see how the output has changed. And that feedback loop is really critical. If you're ever going to do this kind of statistical modeling, it's pretty useless to do it once and then just go with that prediction, right? You have to feed back with real empirical data. Otherwise, Douglas Hubbard will yell at you. So the way that you would use that is you would be able to build the model initially and play with the different variables, kind of holding the other ones constant and tweaking some of them one at a time to get some sense of sensitivity. Because, for example, it isn't much use if it's the case that you're getting a lot more value out of retaining customers than acquiring new ones. If you have to make a choice between doing something to improve the viral coefficient versus doing something to keep your retention good, you can actually quantify which of those changes is going to have a bigger impact on the bottom line using a Monte Carlo simulation. So that kind of feeds back into a cost of delay discussion about, okay, which of these tests is going to buy us the information that is more important for the bottom line. So you use all of these tools together to kind of build this understanding and critically feed that back into the system.
How do you calculate the value?
Nope. It's different in every context, right? So what you would have is your context will differ. Like your product will have its own sort of unique signature of how that pipeline actually looks as it's interfacing with the market, as people are signing up or not signing up, right?
Even
So
before that, imagine that I'm, a customer problem fit, doing a bunch of, interviews with people just to see if, I can get them to
Sure.
order the problems they think they're going to order.
Right.
And I think that's going to derive into some kind of solution model, which is going to make some amount of money based on some cost revenue charge.
Right.
Are you saying that you could sort of make sure that as long as you have that model, you're going to take the results of some of these experiments and say what's kind of like what's the cost of delay would be the impact on the model? Or might kind of Kanban here?
Well, I guess the way that I would do it is early in the process, there are certain parts of the model that you're kind of just going off of industry standard or some outside. You just haven't got anything, you're not charging yet, so it's hard to know kind of what.
This customer factory stuff says, do this, divide by 100 or divide by 10. And divide
Right,
by 10,
right. There's some rules of thumb that you can use.
1,000 users,
Right.
if I can get, 10 to say, yeah, that's the right problem, I'm kind of in the right direction.
Right, and a lot of it is like you're testing against the things that you can actually control, right? So like you have a narrow problem space in the beginning, and you also don't have that much data.
Yeah.
So it's not that useful for prediction early on because you don't have a lot of data and you don't have really the real mechanics. Yeah, absolutely. But as you build in more experiments and you're kind of extending the functionality to become a real product with real people using it, then you can kind of plug those things together.
Actually hitting this thing, then you've got a bit more data.
Right, right.
Okay.
So one thing I would like to do is actually, we're going to have a talk at the end of this track about capturing data using tools like Keen.io. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is hacking around on something where you would actually pull metrics right out of your platform as customers are using it and feed it back into your simulation in real time, like subtly changing those distribution curves based on the data being updated. So I haven't tried that yet, but that's sort of next on my list of projects, that kind of thing. Yes, Jabe. Love it. Google Sheets. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that I'll have to actually use a real tool at some point, but you can do 5,000 simulations in a Google spreadsheet and it updates in like 3 seconds. So it's good enough for really solid statistical modeling. Yeah, use cheap and easy tools if you can. Other questions? One more?
Yeah, just going to feed off of Jake's question. Is there a way of providing some of the stuff that you've done that's kind of agnostic of what you're actually doing? So provide kind of like a starter kit for some of us.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I put a blog post on Neo recently that was sort of about this, and I think what that blog post is missing is it has a screenshot, but I actually want to include the actual vanilla template to the spreadsheet that I used. I basically created sort of a fictional SaaS product for the blog. I can provide that so you can kind of see the details, and then we can maybe like talk about it some more. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? All right.